about aesthetics, and then I have a simple Google slide assignment for you. Aesthetics is philosophy or a branch of philosophy that deals with art and beauty. And so aesthetic theories typically answer two questions. One, what is art? And two, what is beauty? You might think, oh, it's pretty simple. And in some cases, it might be. However, there have been many people who have thought about this over the course of history and put forth a lot of explanation about what changes something from being just a random, maybe even a pleasurable experience, and makes it become something more significant than that, which we would call art. For example, it's halftime. I'm watching a football game right now, and I enjoy watching football. But just because I enjoy watching football doesn't mean that I consider football to be art. Then, once we determine whether something is art, we have to assign some sort of value to it. And so the rules of what we determine to be good art or successful art or beautiful um, are also defined by aesthetic theories. So, a definition of art, or a set of rules that one can use to establish whether an object or experience attains the level of one associates with art, and how successful they are at doing that. And so there have been many theories. There are probably as many theories as there are people. Um, However, I'm going to go ahead and explain 6 of them. Your job is to think about them and decide which ones you agree with. And just because you agree with one theory doesn't mean that you can't agree with another theory as well, and have a multitude of ways that you start to think about determining whether something is art and whether something is good art. So let's look at the first one. It's referred to as the mimetic theory, and it was initially maybe best described by Plato, so it goes back quite a ways. Um, and essentially, mimetic theory is probably where a lot of us start in terms of thinking about art. It has to do with the artist imitating nature. So here we have a picture of a painting of a man, right? And it looks very much like a man. It's very believable, it's very realistic. So you might say, well, why don't we call this realism? Realism is a branch in philosophy that has all sorts of things associated with it that have very little to do with art. So this term, mimetic, maybe comes from the idea of imitating or imitationalism. Um, but it essentially describes what most of us maybe started, thinking about when we thought about art. An artist looks at something, draws it, paints it, sculpts it, and the more realistic it is, the better it is. For which, um, uh, Plato decided that studying art was then useless because it would always be better to study something than it would be to study a copy of that thing. Now, whether or not you agree with that um, determines whether you start to think about some of the other theories, because there were people who disagreed and thought that studying art wasn't useless. Let's say, for example, you are going through divorce, right? You're going to have all sorts of feelings associated with what's happening in your life. It's very hard to be objective and look at it and learn from the experience when you're going through those emotions. But you watch a play or a movie about divorce, and then maybe you think, oh, as an outsider looking at this, I can see this or that maybe you couldn't when you're going through it yourselves. So there were other people who said, no, studying art is not useless. There are many things that art can do beyond just the idea of imitating nature or things that we have already experienced around us. So one such theory is called instrumentalism. And instrumentalism basically um, is the concept that art is an instrument, and that artists can use their medium, clay, paper, music, to communicate something to somebody else. So the more successfully you communicate with people, or the more convincing you are, the better your artwork becomes. Here we have a piece of Russian propaganda or Soviet propaganda. We have these very attractive looking people, a soldier, a worker, and a farmer. Um, and if you were to look at this and say, boy, those people are attractive, and this looks like the kind of thing that I want to be a part of, then you might be convinced to start to believe in the sorts of things that the former Soviet Union wanted you to believe in terms of the way that they ran their country. Um, so if we were in class, we'd be talking about, like how many people think, yeah, there should be a message. Um, but still, people said, well, that's not entirely it, because sometimes we get something from the work, but it's not necessarily a message. Like if you take on a expressionist view of aesthetics, then you would say that art can convey or summon or bring up emotions in people, and that the greater that emotional response, the better that piece of art is. You maybe have gone to a movie that made you very sad. You cried. Oh my gosh, Mr. Walter, it was so sad. I loved it, or I was so scared, Um, those sorts of things can happen when we listen to music, when we look at pictures, when we look at sculptures, and those feelings are hard to put words to. Like we know it's sad or it was happy or something like that, um, but we don't know exactly how to make people feel things. It can be kind of random in a certain sense. You might be painting a cat or sculpting a cat. Somebody else looks at your cat and it makes them cry because they have a strong attachment to a pet from the past or right now. You were just trying to make it look like a cat. Um, but if you do feel something when you look at a piece of artwork, or if somebody feels something, or if you feel something when you're creating an artwork, that counts too, then you've done something that is important according to an expressionist. My mom's like this, like when she talks about her work, she tells you all these stories about why she did this or why she did that because she loves cats and she thought she would make a cat, that would make her feel happy. Um, Now she does more than that too, but she's very much interested in how she feels about the work when she's creating it or when she's looking at artwork. My father, on the other hand, would tell you that you can't control feelings. Like all you can control is what you are working with, and that an art or an artist should be masterful in the way that they work with their things. Whether somebody feels something because they love cats or don't love cats doesn't matter. But if the surface of your piece is beautiful, that's totally in your control. Music doesn't look like anything or remind us of the sounds that we hear in nature, or doesn't try to imitate the sounds in nature, but we love it sometimes when you think about classical music or things like that. So these are formalist concerns, right? If you're a musician, you're dealing with sounds. If you're a painter, you're dealing with shapes and colors. If you're a sculptor, you're dealing with forms and surfaces and lines and planes and things like that. So according to the formalists, if it looks cool and it's supposed to look cool, then it is cool. Or if it's supposed to sound good and it does, then it is good. So whatever the specific, or in the case of the formalists, they refer to this as the significant form of your media is, the better you work with that, the better the artwork is. Like this abstract or non-objective painting. It doesn't look like anything, but we like the way that the shapes come together, or maybe some of us like the way that the shapes come together. So it doesn't have to convey a message. It doesn't have to make you feel anything. It just has to do what it's supposed to do, which is up to the media. If it's visual, it's got to look cool. If it's auditory, it's got to sound cool. If it's a story in a movie or a plot in a play and it's interesting, then it's good. Right? So it all has to do with using what the media gives you and using it well. Now, there are some people who would say that, all this stuff leads us back to this abstract painting that don't really care about, and it's maybe a little bit, too elitist, that certain people understand the media better than other people. Um, and that all goes back to the question of why does art exist in the first place? So not just one person, but many people started to question whether or not art was moving in the right direction and whether or not it was too elitist. They made work that called to attention the fact that maybe art takes itself too seriously sometimes. So those people referred to art as an institution. And therefore, when we talk about those kinds of people talking about the art that's being made today, we refer to them as people who would be institutionalists. So institutionalism is all about the art world or the institution of art in society. So they would say that the question is not what is art, but when does art happen? And they say that you need two things to happen for art to exist. You need somebody to create something, and then you need somebody to look at it or think about it or question it. And once you get somebody to look at it or think about it and question it, now you have an art world. You have an artist and you have an observer, right? And that's an art world of two people. But we all know that the art world is way bigger than that. So if you create something and lots of people look at it and think about it and question whether it's art, and question whether they think, no, it's good art, then you've done something really good. If you put a piece online and it goes viral, it's better than if you just show it to your mom and dad, right? Um, or if it gets the attention of some really important people, like the art reviewer critic from the New York Times. When they write about it, that's better than if your friend next to you says, "Oh, I like it." Now, some people don't like that about the institutional theory because they feel like it's judging people as opposed to judging the art itself. However, an institutionalist would tell you, without people, we don't have art. We need people in an art world to make art happen. This piece is called Fountain, and it's by a famous artist named Marcel Duchamp. And it is a urinal that he submitted to a show of which he was a part of the gallery or the group that was putting on this show. And they wanted to show new stuff back in 1917, so over 100 years ago. And so their rule was that if you paid your entry fee, whatever that was, you got to show your work. And so when he submitted this toilet urinal, he did it with a fake name, R. Mutt, right? And the people got together and they looked at the toilet. In 1917, you can imagine, like it was a very different time back then. They felt like they couldn't do it. It was just kind of like ridiculous to take a toilet from the dumpster and sign it and turn it in and call it art. To which he said, "Ha ha, I knew you guys were phony baloney hypocrites." And he wrote about it. And so then people started thinking about it and was like, well, what does make something art? And so in doing so, he transformed this, everyday object, or what he referred to as a found object sculpture or a ready-made, he called them. It would only make a couple a year. Because he changed the way people thought about it. It's got curves, it's got a form, it's got an interior and exterior. Just because it's a urinal doesn't mean it can't be beautiful. Blah 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 blah. And whether or not you appreciate that, the fact that he changed the way people talked about and thought about art makes him a perfect manipulator of the institution that is the art world. And therefore, this is a very famous piece, even though it was just something that he found discarded behind some building or at a salvage yard or something like that. So that's a pretty contemporary theory, and there are lots of derivations of it, but we talk about that in ceramics too. The last one that I want to go over with you is the open concept. And maybe some of you right out there, right now, are thinking, all this talk about what art is, Mr. Walter, it's for the birds. I don't need someone to describe for me what art is. I already know. I don't need a concept. Well, if that's you, And I've got a theory for you, because there are lots of people like you out there who say defining art is pointless. You know, any rules that we set up are bound to be broken because art is always changing, right? Um, what Plato set up as his rules years and years and years ago are sort of, pointless now, because Plato couldn't have imagined what art would have became 2,000 years later. Just like we can't imagine what art might be like 100 years from now. Like maybe they'll be able to implant things in our mind, and we just see them without having to look at them or what have you. The same way somebody 100 years ago couldn't imagine dinosaurs running around on movie screens because of computer generated animation, that sort of thing. So trying to define art is a fruitless activity. I don't know. So it sounds like you're off the hook, right? We don't ever have to. But really, it comes with a lot of responsibility, because what a person who believes in the open concept would tell you is that the way that you decide whether something is or is not art is by comparing it to art that already exists. And that sounds like, well, how do you know that that's art? But if we look at a few examples here, maybe we'll be able to figure out what they're talking about. So here we have the Mona Lisa, right? And we know that's art because it's in a museum, it's famous, everybody knows about it. There are some beautiful things technically that were done there and that sort of thing. But no one has to describe all that stuff to us for us to know it's art. However, when we look at these two pieces, we might not know them as well as we know the Mona Lisa. Um, the figure on the left is by a famous artist, Bernini, and that's David, and he's getting ready to throw a rock at Goliath, right? And he's full of, determination, and his body's twisting. There's all sorts of beautiful things about it. The painting on the right is a common worker throwing seeds in the air, The Sower by Millet. And if we look at these, we can see that one's a painting, one's a sculpture, they're both figures, they're both portrayed heroically. They both seem to be done with a good concern for like realism, all the different ways, and different kinds of heroes, a famous hero, David, and an unknown hero. We can't even really see his face. So there are lots of similarities between these two. So it's pretty easy to look at one and compare it to the other and say that these are both art and that they're both good art. However, if you were to look at these two pieces before I told you about the fountain piece on the right, you might not be able to find that many similarities. Be like, well, they're both kind of triangular, but one's a painting, that's famous. The other one's a toilet. But now that you know about Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, you could say, oh, both of these pieces are iconic. Both of these pieces maybe are revolutionary in the way that they changed the way people thought about shading, or the way people thought about the art world, that sort of thing. So you could find some similarities because you know more about each piece than somebody who hadn't studied it. So while it sounds like the open concept is a way out of thinking about artwork, don't have to define it, you actually have to know a lot in order to be able to find those similarities. So, all of that was a lot, and you can watch this over, and I simplify it for you sometimes in the assignment sheet.